The Rememberer. When I was a kid, I was almost tricked into going into a black van. I may not entirely recall most of the elements of this story, because I don't think I completely understand what had happened. In fact, it was only after my teachers explained to me what had just happened that I realized the full gravity of the situation. And I remember my heart started beating right in my throat. The story kicked off one chilly morning as I was walking down the sidewalk heading to my school. I must have been 9 at the time, or maybe 8.5. I don't remember that part, but what I do remember is seeing my school at the bottom of the hill, and next to the school there was this white van. I tried to ignore it and I walked closer to the school, but soon I was close enough to my school that the school's high fences were to my right, and to my left, the van stood there. I couldn't resist looking at it anymore, and thinking back at it now, I can't help but feel a bit of dread. Sitting on the front seat was a man who was dressed in a black beanie, and his black jacket was on his headrest. He was cutting something out of his nails with a knife. Then I heard a, "Hey!" Turns out the van had been open, and I didn't notice that there had been a man sitting there. He asked me how I was doing, and the two men were now pointedly looking at me. I don't think I said anything. I just walked off. Then I heard laughing coming from behind me. When I was in my class, I completely forgot about the man. I spent the day having as much fun as one normally does in school, and when I was done, it was time to leave school. Even as I walked out of my school, I was in such high spirits that the sight of the van didn't unsettle me. I walked closer to it, basically hopping, when I heard the man call again. This time he was standing by the fence. I wouldn't have spoken to him, nor would I have stopped, but the look on his face made me do it. He wore a concerned face. He asked me if I've seen her yet. I didn't know who he was talking about, but I immediately started thinking of my mother. He told me it wasn't her, it was my teacher. She'd been calling me, and she looked very angry. He asked me what I'd done, and honestly, I had no idea. I thought maybe I must have left my table a mess again. He then told me that I should go to her, and I started to turn, but then he stopped me. The man told me that she was this way, and he started walking. At this point, my heart started to sink. Of course, in my head, I was worried about my teacher, and so I followed the man. But there was a part of me that felt this was really a bad idea. That part of me was wise beyond its age. The man stopped speaking and kept walking. I asked him where was she, and he said he'd take me to her. He then turned abruptly and gave me a mechanical smile, and that was when I heard the sound of an engine. I turned and saw the white van speeding up the side of the road to us, and then a hand grabbed my arm. I tried to pull myself free, but it was entirely pointless. The man's grip was too strong, and I couldn't break free. He pulled me, and both my feet flew off the ground, and the van stopped before us, making my heart sink into my stomach. And when the van's doors opened and the smell of oil and lawn hit my nose, my throat just blocked. And then there was a loud, blood-curdling scream. The man holding me cursed, then he pushed me to the floor, and then he jumped into the van and they fled. Not a second later, the boy ran past me, chasing the van as fast as he could, while I felt other arms wrap around my neck. The boy must have been one of the seniors in the school, but to me, he felt like a full-grown man, a hero. And the lady who had screamed and had her arms around me was my other teacher, and she had been crying at that point. The Teeper. I saw a strange van when I went to work last week. It was parked out there in front of our offices, and I couldn't help but feel like something was off. So I called the cops. This turned out to have been the best decision I made, because apparently there were lots of drugs that were discovered in the van, and apparently the van's driver had an accomplice in our office. Now we live in this toxic environment where one of us is a drug dealer and the other is a snitch who called the cops. No one knows who is who, and so people walk around staring darts at each other. So I wonder if it was a good idea to call the cops. The patroller. A van followed me to my dorm room till I outwitted it. This story happened last term. I went to my campus main hall to help some of the New Year students settle in. I do this because I am a tutor in my school, and I usually finish my work early, so I have time. Otherwise, if it were up to me, I'd be in my room. I don't go out much, to put it lightly. After the tutoring session, I had to stay behind to fix up the chairs and stuff, and when I was done, I headed out the door. It was dark that night, and I could hear the owls hooting, but the first thing that I saw was the white van parked under the tree a distance away. I really didn't think much of it at first, because after all, this was a school campus. All sorts of repairs are required each year, so I thought this must be a similar situation. As a result, I threw on my scarf and I started on my way back to my room. I think I must have walked for 5 minutes before I wondered if I still had my house key with me. So I pulled out my wallet, only for the keys to fall on the floor. And when I was picking them up, I immediately noticed it. The white van was parked directly behind me. The sight of it made my heart jolt a bit. Why was it all the way here when I left it there? I picked up my keys and started walking again, but this time, as I walked, I listened, and I heard the van driving closer. It didn't have its lights on, and it was driving very slowly so as not to make a noise, but the thing was absolutely following me. Understandably, I panicked for a second, but then I remembered the campus patrols. Playing calm, I turned around the road and I walked, headed to the campus patrols. And as I walked, I heard the car following me, which was good for me in the long run. I turned one more street and walked, but then I noticed I couldn't hear it anymore. I casually turned around, pretending like I heard someone calling me, and I saw that the van wasn't there anymore. I felt stupid. Why did I think anybody would be following me? What would they want from me? With that thought in mind, I turned and walked back home. It took me an extra 12 minutes, but I finally started seeing the building to my home. And when I saw it, I stopped. Under a tree a distance from my building, there was the van. At this point, you can imagine how creeped out I was. I didn't know what was happening, nor what that stupid car wanted from me. But yet there it was right there. How did they even know where I lived? I didn't know. But by then I realized it was imperative that I go to the police. I found the campus patrols and told them what had happened. They drove me back to my apartment, and at the sight of their car, the van drove off. The patrollers sounded their siren, and shocking to nobody, the van didn't stop. It just drove off. I haven't seen that van since, but it has made me less likely to go out at night for any occasion. The Croucher. A strange man visited me at work and waited for me outside. I worked at a burger joint over the summer, and I don't think I ever will do that again. It is a fairly small shop, owned by an elderly guy we call Steve. It was my first summer there, and Steve showed me the ropes, so to speak. He told us how to make the burger, how to clean the place, how to get rid of customers when we were closing, and finally, he gave us a strangely specific warning. He said if there was a guy who arrived here in a white van, we should not let him into the shop. But he reassured us that the guy hadn't been around in years now, but he liked to warn his workers beforehand. And the guy did eventually arrive. It had been a few weeks in, and we'd already gotten used to working there. I was working the reception when a man arrived through the door. He was a big-bellied man with a scruffy face, and he walked with something that looked like a limp. And when he got close to me, I couldn't believe what my nose was telling me about him. The man greeted me, his eyes darting around the back. I tried to be polite as I spoke to him, but it was hard. He kept looking around as if he were expecting someone. And finally, when he seemed sure no one was coming, he looked straight at me, and I felt a sudden chill. The man asked me my name, my age, where I went to school, and finally, he asked me when we were leaving. I told him these things, hoping it would make him leave quickly, but it seemed to keep him around longer. But eventually, he sensed my air and nodded, bidding me well, and he left. Immediately after he was gone, one of my coworkers ran in. She told me that he was the guy with the white van and said that I should have kicked him out sooner. By then, I was scared. I didn't know what I could have done. Finally, we finished our shift, and I was so scared that I was going to leave last. I went to the window before I did, and there it was. There was the white van, just parked outside our place. I knew that I couldn't leave like this. So I went out of the back and I crouched next to the beans before running away. My coworker found me and she picked me up. Unfortunately, going by the car meant we had no choice but to go past the white van. When we looked up to the rear view mirror, the guy walked out of his car. Now he was standing by the sidewalk, covered completely in darkness, but we could feel it. We could feel his angry stare. The straighter. I was followed and cornered by a van and some guy. This story happened to me when I was about 12 years old. I want to say 13 because I remember I was wearing shorts that I bought to celebrate my teen years. But at the same time, I feel like it was 12 because in this story, I was still friends with Mark. It was a normal afternoon and Mark had wanted to go to the park where we rode around all day in our bikes. But at around midday, we were very exhausted. And so we sat on the swings and lightly swung while we were talking about something. And it was then that I first saw them. I say them, but really, to be more accurate, it was then that I first saw it, a white van. The van was parked under the tree some distance away. At first, I assumed it was some kind of electrician's car, but the more I looked at it, the stranger the van got. For one, the van didn't seem to have any kind of emblem on it, showing which company they worked for. And the more I looked at it, the more I discovered creepy things. For example, I noticed that its wheels were entirely black, and also, its windows were entirely tinted too, so we can't see the people inside, nor what they are doing. But the most troubling thing that I noticed as I stayed at that car is that the van was directly looking at us. It was parked in such a way that whoever was inside that car got a clear view of us and what we were doing. So yes, that was fairly creepy if you ask me. I turned and noticed that Mark was looking at the van too, but when he saw I was looking at him, he smiled and went back to telling a story. But I didn't blame him for it. I also didn't want to look weak, so I too remained quiet about the van I saw. We must have stayed there and played a bit longer, but the presence of the van just made things a bit more uncomfortable, so we finished our session sooner. I said my goodbyes and left him there. And that was when that day really began for me. I was walking home by the sidewalks, my mind on what I was going to eat when I got home, but then I noticed something. There was a man standing a distance in front of me. He kept moving from foot to foot and was rubbing his hands together. And even though it was hot, I didn't think he had any right to be sweating that hard. And to make matters worse, he was waiting for me. He didn't say it, but I could tell from how his fidgeting got progressively worse as I drew closer, and how his eyes kept pinging to me, then back to the floor. I could tell this man was waiting for me, whether I should walk further. When I heard a wheel screeching, I quickly turned around and saw the white van. It was rushing up the road and flying toward my direction. And to make matters worse, when I looked in front of me, I saw the sweating man was outright looking at me now. He looked at me for a few moments, and then he smiled. He dashed towards me, cackling like a hyena, and his hands held out like he was about to lift up a baby. But I decided that wasn't going to be happening here. I turned to the side and ran, running straight to the fence next to me. I climbed the fence in great leaps. Then when I got to the top, I was so scared that I fell over the edge instead of climbing down. It did hurt my shoulder and my chest, but I was still alive. And so I ran. When I was a distance away, I looked back at the man, and there they sat, staring at me in distaste and anger. But I was alive and safe.